"What are you waiting for, Sergeant? Salute me now." The words rang out like a gunshot in the crisp London air. They weren't whispered in jest, nor delivered with a smile. They were barked as an order, sharp, arrogant, dripping with authority. And in that instant, hundreds of curious eyes turned toward the confrontation that would shake the embassy, rattle traditions, and leave one nation's officer humiliated in front of the world. But to understand how it came to this moment, we must return to the beginning of that morning. The sun had barely broken through the thin veil of London mist when the gleaming black motorcade rolled toward Buckingham Palace. Engines purred with precision, the vehicles polished to a mirror shine, their windows tinted, concealing the dignitaries inside. Each movement was choreographed: the stop at the gates, the brief pause for inspection, the smooth glide into the courtyard where centuries of history seemed to press in from every direction. The air carried the faint fragrance of freshly trimmed roses from the palace gardens, their red and white petals glowing faintly in the dew. The stones beneath the visitors' feet were worn from generations of guardsmen marching their eternal patterns. To the tourists pressed up against the iron gates, phones raised high, this was a chance to witness living history. To the military officers arriving in that motorcade, however, it was more than ceremony. It was a meeting of cultures, traditions, and egos. The American delegation had come for the annual NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Flags fluttered from the vehicles, signaling their importance to every camera trained upon them. Security was tight, but the crowd's excitement hummed like an electric current. Children pointed at the towering sentries in scarlet coats, while veterans in worn blazers straightened their backs with quiet pride. When the car doors opened, the first to emerge was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale. He was every inch the Marine officer, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals that told of decades in combat zones from Baghdad to Helmand Province. He adjusted his immaculate uniform with quick, deliberate tugs, as though every crease and line were part of a battlefield drill. His eyes, however, betrayed something the polished surface could not hide: impatience. "All this pomp," he muttered under his breath to Major Thomas Ward, his aide and loyal companion, "for what's essentially a glorified meeting. We could have done this at the Pentagon and skipped the theatrics." Ward said nothing. His gaze had already wandered across the courtyard, to where a single figure stood immobile against the stone facade of the palace, a royal guard. Scarlet tunic, white belt, gleaming buttons, a portrait out of time. The massive bearskin cap loomed above his expressionless face, his rifle resting with mechanical precision against his shoulder. He did not blink. He did not flinch. He was a living statue, the embodiment of centuries-old discipline. Tourists snapped photos and whispered in awe, but Hale's lips curled in a smirk. To him, this was theatre, not soldiering. He saw not a warrior but a mannequin in uniform. The air around the delegation pulsed with two energies: the anticipation of the crowd, hungry for pageantry, and the subtle irritation of Hale, a man who had led men into firestorms and now found himself surrounded by ornaments. He tugged his gloves tighter, his boots clicking against the ancient stones as he prepared to follow the schedule laid before him. What Hale did not yet know was that the quiet figure standing in scarlet across the courtyard, Sergeant Daniel Cross, was no ornament. He was no actor in a costume. And before the day ended, Cross's discipline, forged in the fires of war, would not only silence Hale but etch itself into the memory of everyone present. Sergeant Daniel Cross stood exactly where he had been ordered to stand, as if his boots had fused with the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. His scarlet tunic glowed like a burning ember against the pale grey walls, the massive bearskin cap casting a shadow across his eyes. Yet even without seeing them, onlookers could sense his gaze, fixed, unwavering, the 1,000-yard stare honed by years of service both ceremonial and combat. For tourists, Cross was part of the postcard, a soldier frozen in time, an artifact of royal tradition. For those who knew his record, however, the man was something else entirely. Cross had served 4 combat deployments. In Helmand, he had pulled a wounded comrade to safety under relentless enemy fire, refusing to retreat until every man in his unit was accounted for. In Iraq, he had led a night patrol through hostile alleys, coordinating with American Marines to secure intelligence that later disrupted a major insurgent attack. 3 months earlier, during a classified joint operation, his unit had extracted a high-value intelligence asset from deep within enemy territory, the mission so dangerous that even seasoned American Special Forces officers had doubted its success. Cross returned with all his men alive. For that, he was awarded the Military Cross for Valor. His personnel file contained more than medals. American commanders had written in their evaluations, "unflappable under pressure." Extraordinary discipline in chaotic conditions. A soldier whose steadiness saves lives. And now here he was, standing still before a palace wall, rifle in hand, because his discipline was needed not only on the battlefield but in the public eye, where composure itself was a form of service. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale didn't see any of that. His boots clicked as he stepped out of line, straying from the delegation's carefully choreographed route. Major Thomas Ward opened his mouth to stop him but closed it again. He had seen that look in Hale's eyes before, curiosity sharpened into contempt. Hale circled cross slowly, like an instructor inspecting a new recruit. Incredible detail on the uniform, he muttered loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear, his voice teetering between admiration and mockery. Though I wonder how practical that bearskin hat would be in an actual combat zone. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. They were used to tourists trying to provoke the guards, but not to a decorated American officer doing it. Cameras tilted, recording every move. "Lieutenant Colonel," said a voice, polite but firm. Edward Marlowe, the Palace Tour coordinator, had hurried over, a practiced smile pinned tightly across his face. "If you'd kindly rejoin your group, we have a precisely timed schedule to maintain." But Hale wasn't listening. His gaze flicked back to Cross, that living statue who refused to acknowledge his presence. Something about the soldier's silence gnawed at him. As the delegation resumed its walk, Hale whispered to Ward, his voice sharp. "Tell me something. These guards, they're just ceremonial, right? For the tourists." Before Ward could respond, Hale turned toward the group, his words slicing through Edward Marlowe's carefully rehearsed lecture about the palace gardens. "It's like having mannequins in uniform," Hale announced. "Back home, we put our soldiers to actual use." The words carried far enough for Colonel James Whitlock, the senior American officer, to hear. His brow furrowed. "The Royal Guards are an operational battalion of the British Army, Richard. They rotate between ceremonial duties and regular deployments." Hale raised an eyebrow, his voice dry with sarcasm. "Seems inefficient. Combat-trained personnel standing like statues? In the Corps, we optimize utility. Every man, every hour, focused on readiness." Across the courtyard, Captain Adrian Whitford of the Royal Guard Command narrowed his eyes. He had overseen these men for years, and he knew trouble when he saw it. Hale's gestures, his tone, his restless movements, they were a storm gathering over what should have been a calm diplomatic morning. What Hale couldn't know, or refused to consider, was that Sergeant Cross was chosen for this duty precisely because of his steel composure. The same iron discipline that had steadied him under machine gun fire was what allowed him to stand motionless now, unshaken by the scrutiny of strangers. And yet, the silence between the two men began to crackle. One saw a statue, the other embodied a soldier's oath. The clash was inevitable. The group had barely moved past the western facade when Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale slowed his steps. His eyes were no longer on the ornate stonework or the roses in bloom. They were fixed squarely on Sergeant Daniel Cross, that unmoving figure, a soldier who seemed to breathe discipline with every second of silence. Hale felt irritation crawl under his skin. How could a trained fighter stand so still, ignoring everything, refusing to acknowledge even the presence of a senior officer? It wasn't discipline to Hale. It was defiance disguised as tradition. He broke from the group again. Major Thomas Ward, already tense from the earlier display, noticed immediately. "Colonel, the delegation." Hale waved him off without turning. Just a quick professional exchange. The word professional dripped with sarcasm. The crowd sensed something unusual. Tourists lowered their voices, phones raised higher, lenses zooming in. Everyone knew the guards never moved, never spoke. To see an officer approach one so aggressively promised drama. Hale positioned himself directly in Cross's line of sight. He leaned slightly, searching for a flicker in the man's eyes, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. There was nothing. Cross might as well have been carved from stone. "Impressive discipline," Hale said at last, his voice pitched so both the crowd and his American colleagues could hear. "Though I wonder, what tactical advantage comes from standing motionless while a potential threat evaluates your position?" A ripple ran through the onlookers. Some chuckled nervously. Others frowned, recognizing disrespect. A mother pulled her child back by the hand, whispering that they should keep their distance. Hale began to circle slowly, boots scraping across the cobblestones. "In the Corps, we train Marines to respond to threats, not ignore them. This ceremonial rigidity might look good on postcards, Sergeant, but military effectiveness is measured by adaptability. Wouldn't you agree? Cross gave no sign he'd even heard. His eyes, fixed forward, stared into infinity. Ward stepped closer, lowering his voice. Sir, the delegation is moving on. Colonel Whitlock will notice your absence. But Hale wasn't finished. He stopped directly in front of Cross, close enough that the faint sheen of polish on the soldier's buttons reflected his face. Tell me, Sergeant, Hale pressed, does standing still like a mannequin prepare you for the chaos of combat? Or is this the British way of pretending tradition is training? Gasps rose from the crowd. A group of American tourists whispered nervously, one of them muttering, "Is he really doing this?" to a guard. Cross's rifle remained perfectly still at his side. His jawline didn't tighten, his eyes didn't flicker. The silence became oppressive, almost heavier than words. And then Hale leaned in, his voice dropping just enough that only those closest could hear, yet sharp enough that it carried to the microphones of nearby cameras. We'll continue this discussion later, Sergeant. I'm curious to see how this ceremonial training translates to real combat. Still nothing. Not a blink. Ward finally gripped Hale's elbow firmly, steering him back toward the delegation. But even as he allowed himself to be pulled away, Hale glanced back, his lips curling into a smirk. To him, silence was weakness. To Cross, it was strength. The crowd didn't know yet which would prove truer. And in that silence, a storm was already building. The American delegation moved deeper into the palace grounds, but Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale lagged behind, his stride stiff with restrained contempt. His boots struck the stone with measured force, each step echoing his growing frustration. He could not let it go. That silent soldier, that mannequin in red, the idea gnawed at him. How could an army waste combat-ready men on ceremonial games? And worse, how could that sergeant ignore a superior officer, a man decorated across 3 theaters of war? Without warning, Hale peeled away once more. This time even Colonel James Whitlock's stern call of, "Lieutenant Colonel Hale, maintain formation," couldn't hold him. He was determined. The crowd sensed it instantly. Camera phones angled higher, lenses adjusting. Tourists whispered, their voices tinged with anticipation. This wasn't just a passing moment anymore. This was confrontation. Hale stopped directly before Sergeant Daniel Cross, his shadow cutting across the scarlet tunic. Cross didn't move, didn't blink. His stillness made the lieutenant colonel's agitation look even sharper. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hale began, raising his voice so the gathering crowd could hear, "what you are witnessing today is an interesting contrast in military philosophies." He gestured broadly toward Cross, his medals catching the sunlight. "This is the British approach. Ceremony, precision, ritual, soldiers standing still while tourists clap." Murmurs rippled outward. Some tourists chuckled awkwardly, others bristled, offended by the disrespect. "In my 22 years with the United States Marine Corps," Hale continued, puffing out his chest, "I've led men through Baghdad, Fallujah, and Helmand Province. In every case, our survival depended on adaptability, tactical awareness, immediate response. Not this." He swept his hand toward Cross. "Tell me, Sergeant, how does standing motionless prepare you for the chaos of modern combat?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Cross did not move. His rifle remained at the same angle, his eyes locked forward as if Hale were a ghost. Then, from within the crowd, a voice broke the tension. "Young man, you're out of line." An elderly figure stepped forward. His blazer was neatly pressed, though worn at the edges, and on its breast gleamed a row of medals dulled only by age. His back was straight, his eyes sharp. He was Colonel Arthur Beckett, Ret, a veteran of wars Hale had studied in history books. "These guardsmen," Beckett said firmly, "have served in the same combat zones you boast about. Their ceremonial duty represents discipline, not deficiency." The crowd leaned in, eager. Here was not a tourist, but a soldier, one whose words carried the weight of decades. Hale turned sharply, assessing him with a quick glance. "With respect, sir, I'm simply pointing out differences in military readiness. A soldier who spends hours practicing standing still is not developing the tactical flexibility modern warfare demands." Beckett's jaw tightened. "You think stillness is weakness? Then you've never been pinned under fire, watching chaos unfold, knowing the only thing keeping your men alive is discipline. These guards have it. Do you?" Gasps swept through the onlookers. Some applauded softly, others muttered approval. Cameras flashed, capturing Hale's narrowing eyes. Unfazed, he stepped even closer to Cross, violating the invisible barrier every visitor respected. The crowd hissed at the breach. "You know what impresses me about American forces?" Hale barked, his voice cutting through the air. When a Marine is addressed by a superior, he responds. He doesn't hide behind silence. He doesn't use tradition as an excuse to ignore authority. He leaned in, so close the sunlight glinted off Cross's bayonet. His words were low now, but sharp enough to slice through the silence. "Tell me, Sergeant, have you ever actually seen combat? Or did they put you here because you look good in red?" A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. A woman clutched her husband's arm. A teenager whispered, "He didn't just say that." And then, from across the courtyard, Colonel James Whitlock's voice thundered, sharp and unyielding. "Lieutenant Colonel Hale, rejoin the delegation. Immediately." For the first time, Hale hesitated. His jaw flexed, his chest rose and fell with restrained anger. But as he turned back toward the crowd, he saw it in their eyes, judgment. He had not impressed them. He had unsettled them. Cross, however, remained utterly motionless, the eye of the storm. And that silence was louder than Hale's every word. The delegation's next stop was the changing of the guard. Tourists surged to the courtyard, eager for the pageantry, their phones raised like a sea of blinking eyes. Amidst the shuffle, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale slipped away yet again, his stride deliberate, his jaw locked. He had waited long enough. Sergeant Daniel Cross stood at his post, rifle gleaming, eyes fixed forward. He looked unchanged, as if the tension from earlier had never touched him. But Hale's return drew attention instantly. The crowd's chatter dimmed, replaced by a hush thick with anticipation. They could feel it coming, the explosion, the confrontation that would define the day. Hale stopped directly in front of Cross, boots squared, chest heaving. "Your ceremonial changing of the guard is quite the performance," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard like a sermon. "Impressive choreography, I'll grant you that. But in the Marines, we change posts with efficiency, not pageantry. Let me explain something about protocol." He tapped the insignia on his chest with a stiff finger. Tap, tap, each sound like a hammer striking steel. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale, United States Marine Corps. Combat decorations from Baghdad, Fallujah, Helmand. Joint Command Authority under NATO. And you. He jabbed his finger toward Cross. A sergeant. Standing still. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some phones zoomed in, their cameras trembling. Everyone knew the first rule at Buckingham: never touch the guards. But Hale didn't care. He reached out and pinched the scarlet sleeve between thumb and forefinger, rolling the fabric as though appraising a market trinket. "Wool," he said disdainfully. "In combat, this would get you killed. Heavy. Soaks up rain. Useless." The air itself seemed to flinch. "He touched him," someone whispered. He actually touched him. The tourists shifted uneasily, torn between fascination and outrage. Palace security edged closer, their radios hissing softly, but none dared intervene yet. The diplomatic risk was too high. Hale wasn't finished. His hand slid downward, brushing the barrel of Cross's rifle. Ceremonial weapon, or actually functional? This time the murmurs rose into a wave. A woman gasped audibly. Children craned their necks to see. For the first time that morning, the camera stopped clicking selfies. They recorded with intent. And then Hale stepped directly into Cross's line of sight, blocking his view of the palace grounds entirely. His boots planted, his chin lifted, he squared his shoulders in the posture of command. "The difference," he declared, "is responsiveness. A Marine acknowledges superior officers, maintains situational awareness, responds to changing conditions. Not this," he stabbed a finger toward Cross's face. "Not standing still for tourists." The courtyard held its breath. Hale inhaled, filling his chest, his voice dropping into the hard bark of command. "Guard," he boomed. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale, United States Marine Corps, NATO Joint Command authorized. By military protocol across Allied forces, junior personnel are required to render appropriate respect to senior officers." He took one step closer, so close the tips of their boots almost touched. His words cracked through the air, each one sharp and deliberate. This is a direct order. Salute me now." The words echoed like a rifle shot against the palace walls. For a long, unbearable second, the only sound was the rustle of flags in the wind. Cross did not move. His scarlet uniform blazed against the grey, his 1,000-yard stare unbroken. He might have been carved from marble. And then, without warning, he moved. The shift was so precise, so sudden, it startled even those watching closely. His gloved hand rose in a single fluid motion, not to salute, but to close around Hale's hand, the one still hovering near his rifle. With effortless strength, Cross removed the colonel's fingers from the weapon, releasing them with mechanical efficiency. "Sir," Cross said at last, his voice crisp, resonant, and unmistakably British. The crowd froze, stunned by the break in silence. "You are in violation of standing orders regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard. Physical contact with a guard or his equipment constitutes a Category B security infraction." Gasps and murmurs cascaded like thunder. Cameras snapped furiously. Hale blinked, momentarily stunned. He had expected silence, or at best an awkward salute. Not this. Not words delivered with the authority of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Cross's eyes, once fixed forward, now locked directly onto Hale's. His stare was not defiance but clarity, the steel of a soldier speaking his oath. "Furthermore," Cross continued, his voice even, unwavering, "while your rank commands respect within NATO, standing palace protocol establishes clear guidelines regarding the chain of command on royal grounds. The Queen's Guard operates under the authority of the Crown, not NATO command. Standing Order 157 specifically requires that guards maintain their position and bearing regardless of visiting rank. My oath is sworn first to the sovereign. My duty is to the Crown." The words fell like stone into water, rippling through the silent courtyard. "This is not a matter of disrespect to your rank, sir," Cross concluded, his tone calm but immovable. "It is absolute respect for the oath of service I have sworn." With the same fluidity, his gloved hand returned to his rifle. He resumed position, motionless once more, as though nothing had happened. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, not with boos, but with the deafening chorus of whispers, gasps, and camera shutters. The tension had snapped, but the all lingered. And for the first time that day, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale had no words. The courtyard was still buzzing from Sergeant Daniel Cross's sudden words when another voice, steady and commanding, cut through the noise. "Lieutenant Colonel Hale." The crowd parted as Captain Adrian Whitford, commander of the Royal Guard, strode forward. His boots struck the stone with confidence born of years in uniform, his dark eyes unwavering. His presence alone quieted the murmurs. Whitford stopped a few paces from Hale, inclining his head slightly in formal acknowledgement. "Captain Adrian Whitford, Guard Commander. I believe there may be some misunderstanding regarding protocol on palace grounds." Hale turned sharply, his chest still heaving from Cross's defiance. "Your guard broke position to address me. That alone proves my point. Rigidity is weakness." "On the contrary, sir," Whitford replied evenly, his tone clipped and precise. Sergeant Cross followed Standing Order 157, Paragraph 3. In the event of physical contact or immediate security concern, guards are authorized to respond with the minimum necessary action and communication. Nothing more. Nothing less. The crowd leaned closer. To them, this sounded less like a casual explanation and more like testimony in a tribunal. Hale bristled. "In 30 years of service across 4 continents, I've never had a junior officer refuse a direct order from a superior." Whitford's gaze sharpened. "That's because Sergeant Cross wasn't refusing an order, Lieutenant Colonel. He was fulfilling one. His primary directive, while on these grounds, is to the Crown. His chain of command flows through palace authority, not visiting military personnel, regardless of rank." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in understanding, others shook their heads, clearly siding with Hale. The courtyard had become a theatre of military law. From the back of the delegation, Colonel James Whitlock finally stepped forward. His face was calm, but his tone carried an edge. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is waiting. You've delayed us long enough." But Hale pressed on, unwilling to yield. "This is nonsense. In NATO joint operations, chain of command is universal. Courtesy demands acknowledgement of superior rank. If your guards ignore that, it's a liability." Whitford didn't flinch. "In joint operations, yes. On palace grounds, no. These orders are not arbitrary, Colonel. They exist to protect the integrity of the guard's duty to the sovereign. Their silence, their stillness, it is part of their oath. Without it, they compromise the very tradition they are sworn to defend. Hale opened his mouth again, but Whitford cut him off, his voice low and deliberate. What you witnessed today, sir, was not defiance. It was restraint. Sergeant Cross exercised discipline under provocation. That is the very essence of military strength. A hush fell. Even Hale, red-faced and bristling, hesitated. At that moment, Colonel Arthur Beckett, Ret, called out from the crowd, his voice rough but steady. Discipline is what keeps men alive under fire, son. You do well to remember that. The words landed heavy. Some of the American officers exchanged glances. Cameras caught everything. The confrontation, the arguments, the clash of philosophies playing out in real time. Colonel Whitlock's patience snapped. He stepped between Hale and Whitford, his tone final. That's enough. Lieutenant Colonel Hale, rejoin the delegation immediately. You've already created a diplomatic incident. This ends now. For the first time, Hale found himself isolated, his authority blunted not by silence, but by the weight of every other voice around him. And still, behind them, Sergeant Daniel Cross stood immovable, the embodiment of the very discipline Hale sought to dismiss. The courtyard slowly exhaled after the clash. Tourists whispered to one another, their voices trembling with excitement. Some scrolled through their phones, uploading videos already climbing into thousands of views. The confrontation had leapt from palace stones to the digital world in seconds. But at the center of it all stood two men, one silent, unmoving in scarlet, the other flushed and restless in decorated green. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale tightened his jaw, trying to salvage his dignity. He turned to Major Thomas Ward, his voice low but sharp. British inflexibility hasn't changed since colonial times. They cling to outdated rituals and call it discipline. Ward didn't reply. His silence was not agreement but exhaustion. The American officers around them had grown distant. Their steps slowed, their eyes averted. Colonel James Whitlock gave subtle orders with a glance, forming a quiet buffer between Hale and the rest of the delegation. No one wanted to stand too close to the man who had embarrassed his own uniform. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, Sergeant Daniel Cross remained motionless. His scarlet coat gleamed, his rifle steady. To the untrained eye, he looked the same as before, but to those who had watched closely, his silence now carried weight. He had spoken once, and that was enough. As the delegation prepared to leave, Whitlock approached Hale with the calm authority of a man who rarely raised his voice because he didn't need to. Lieutenant Colonel, the vehicles are waiting. His tone made it clear, this was not a suggestion. Hale bristled. They're soldiers, not statues. Military effectiveness is measured by adaptability, not theatrical performance. Another voice answered, deep, calm, and commanding. General Robert Stanton, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Interesting perspective, Lieutenant Colonel. Yet I noted Sergeant Cross adapted quite effectively to your challenge. His response was measured, precise, and professional. The words cut sharper than any reprimand. Hale turned, incredulous. A rehearsed response to a predictable situation isn't adaptability, sir. It's script following. Perhaps, Stanton mused, his eyes steady on Hale, but it resolved the situation decisively while maintaining protocol. Tactical objective achieved with minimum force. That, to me, is effective soldiering. Hale's lips pressed into a thin line. Around him, the silence of his peers weighed heavier than Cross's earlier stillness. He had become an island, uniform gleaming, medals shining, but utterly alone. The motorcade rolled into position, engines humming. Officers filed back into formation, their posture crisp, their discipline intact. Hale followed, but the subtle shift of shoulders, the space others left around him, spoke volumes. He was present, but not included. As the cars pulled away, Hale stared stonily through the tinted glass. His reflection gazed back at him, stern, decorated, and defiant. Yet beneath it all lay something he would never admit, the sting of being dismissed not with defiance, but with discipline. Outside, Sergeant Daniel Cross remained in position, scarlet blazing against the grey stone of Buckingham. His figure did not move, did not waver. To the tourists still lingering, he was no longer just a guard. He was a symbol, of silence that spoke louder than arrogance, of discipline that triumphed over pride. The last image the Americans carried with them as the motorcade vanished into London streets was not the grandeur of the palace, nor the flutter of flags. It was the solitary figure of Cross, rifle at his side, gaze fixed forward, unshaken. What does true respect for military traditions look like across international boundaries? Today's story reminds us that respect is not about imposing one's own standards, but about recognizing the integrity of another's. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hale believed he was upholding military courtesy. Instead, he revealed his arrogance. Sergeant Daniel Cross, through silence and discipline, revealed something greater, that tradition and readiness are not enemies, but allies. And as the palace gates closed behind the delegation, one truth remained: uniforms fade, commands pass, but discipline endures.